But we are honored to have 4 very distinguished members of Congress, each of whom is expert in this area and whom I'm sure you're going to be delighted to hear from. We have Congressman Ralph Norton from South Carolina. We have Congressman Tom McClintock from the People's Republic of California. We have Congressman Ben Cline from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And by the way, give Congressman Cline just a little extra applause because he is a leap year baby, so tomorrow is his birthday. And finally, holding home court advantage, we have a new member of Congress, one whom I'm sure you're going to be delighted to hear from, Congresswoman McClintock. As you know, USMCA was voted on a couple of years ago, and 3 of the members on our panel voted for it. So the passage of the USMCA trade deal was very, very significant for this country, and I'm going to let them get right into it and discuss how significant it was and why greater access on the northern and southern border for our farmers is important. And to begin that conversation, Congressman Norman.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for stepping in at the last minute. I want to thank all of you for taking your time to come to CPAC. You know, to be among conservatives who will take the time, take your dollars to spend to come to a state that's open for business is just fantastic. And aren't the speakers unbelievable? Kristi Noem, how good is she? So it's an honor to be here, and Ben, my grandson's got his 18th birthday. So birthdays are good, particularly to celebrate here. Hey, we're going to do that. I'm from South Carolina. For those of you who have ever been to Charleston, you have come to God's country, and to visit there is the greatest trip you'll ever make historically. I represent the 5th District. I took over. You may have heard of a guy by the name of Mick Mulvaney. He was, when he was appointed as OMB for the Trump administration, I ran for his seat in a special election. And South Carolina is, it's right at 5 million people. We are a state that is home to BMW. We're a state that's home to Boeing. We're a state that's home to Volvo, which should open the latter part of this year or maybe next year due to COVID. And real right-to-work state. Right-to-work means unions aren't mandatory. They can come to South Carolina and operate and produce their product. And we're doing it well, because South Carolina is where a lot of businesses want to come. It's because we keep our taxes low, we keep the regulations low, and we're like Kristi Noem, we're open for business. We're like Florida, we're open for business. And the USMCA was a welcome relief, particularly for the car manufacturers, because they had, as Donald Trump has always said, and other members of the panel, they want free trade, but they want fair trade. China has not always been fair trade. China has been a country that has been, it's a communist country. If you want to know how they treat people, look at how they treated the Uyghurs. And that's how we have to deal with them. But we were involved and we're one of the top 10 states for exports. And we had, I think it was last year, $40 billion in trade. Exports that went out of South Carolina. And it's because of our policies that did not allow steel to be dumped into South Carolina, into the USA. It's because President Trump insisted on not letting them make our gowns, and they manipulate their currency and also manipulate the labor that goes into making the gowns and just undercutting everybody, therefore eliminating your competition. So MCA was a godsend, not just for the automobile industry, but for farmers. We opened up the trade market for milk, which hadn't been there before. And that's one of the dangers that I see that we face as a nation with this administration because they don't really understand it. They're not business people. They've never created a job in their life. They've been professional politicians. And I'm scared to death of the regulations that are going to come. I'm scared to death of the assault on our right to work status. The labor unions have got a hold on this administration, which, by the way, is why Boeing came to South Carolina. But it's something, folks, that we've got to just deal with. We've got to fight, and hopefully we'll overcome it and live to fight another day with more conservatives that operate the White House and then from the White House on down. I'll stop there and pass it on to my good friend Tom McClintock.
Yeah, and Congressman McClintock, we'd like to hear from you, especially about the principles of free trade.
Well, great. Well, I'm from California, which was the home of all of those businesses that are now moving to South Carolina and Texas and Florida, Idaho and Virginia, you name it. Let me just make the case why we conservatives have got to stand foursquare for free trade. Free trade is simply freedom of commerce, and it's absolutely essential to the prosperity of any country. Three quick questions. The first was posed 150 years ago by Frederick Bastiat, talking about the same issues then as we are today. And the question he posed was this. He said, look at everything that we invest, tunneling through mountains and bridging great canyons and dredging great harbors and building railroads across vast wastelands. Why do we do all of that? We do it for one reason. It's to overcome the natural obstacles that prevent us from trading goods and services with others. Why, having gone to all of that expense and travail to overcome the obstacles that nature has placed in the way of trade, for us to then go and erect our own artificial barriers for that same trade? And that's all that tariffs are. Second question was posed by Laffer and Kudlow a few years ago. I thought they made a very good point. When we really want to screw over an adversary, short of dropping bombs on them, what do? We impose economic sanctions, right? What are economic sanctions? They're impediments against that country's ability to import products. What are tariffs? They're impediments against our country's ability to import products. Why would we be doing to ourselves something we reserve only for our worst enemies? And the third question comes also from Bastiat. It's a very simple question. What's better, abundance or scarcity? Now, that should be a self-evident question, but it doesn't seem to be in a lot of the debates over trade these days. Abundance or scarcity? If $1 can buy one widget in the United States, but it can buy two widgets in Canada, then isn't the path to an abundance of widgets through Canada? Now, the protectionists will tell us, oh, well, it's just not fair. The conditions are different. They pay their labor less. They're not very nice to us. They're not very nice to their own people, whatever it is. Of course, Canadians are very polite, but apply to any country. So we'll slap $1 tariff on the Canadian widget. What have we just done to ourselves? We have just cut the supply of widgets available to us per dollar literally in half. We have taken an abundance of widgets and turned it into a scarcity of widgets. Oh, but this is to protect the producers, they say. We did that for steel a few years ago. We have to protect those 140,000 American jobs that depend on steel from being undercut and undersold in unfair trade. Well, we completely forgot about the 6.5 million Americans who work manufacturing things made from steel, everything from cans to cars. So we protected some of those 140,000 steel jobs at the expense of losing some of those 6.5 million manufacturing jobs in this country that depended upon steel. That just makes no sense at all. We always in these debates forget that every producer, which is what the tariffs are supposed to protect, is also a consumer. No producer has ever been helped by making resources scarcer. No consumer has ever been helped by making prices higher. And those are the two things that tariffs accomplish. So that's the case for free trade. And if conservatives don't stand behind that, there won't be anybody in the country standing behind it. And history is very clear on this point. Protectionism always harms the economy of any country that engages in it. Free trade always produces prosperity in any country that engages in it. And I don't know of any exceptions to that law. So anyway, that's it.
Congressman.
Thanks.
And if you haven't read Bastiat, read them.
Well, and again, remember, these were his essays on free trade. They were written 150 years ago. They sound like they could have been written yesterday. Same arguments, same sophistries, and it just tells you that even in the physical sciences, we learn from our mistakes, we learn from our advances, we build them into our body of nature, of knowledge. In political science, we just make the same mistakes over and over.
Congressman Cline, this should be very interesting. They tell me that you're going to talk about Trump versus Biden on trade.
Well, I am so glad to be here at CPAC with all of you freedom-loving Americans breathing the fresh air of liberty. It is exciting to be out of Fort Pelosi, where she builds walls to the only place where she's tearing down walls at the border with Mexico, building them around our Congress, our halls of democracy. It is a sad state of affairs in the swamp. And I am glad to be with you all talking about free trade with my friend Tom McClintock, with whom I served on the Judiciary Committee last term. He is so eloquent, and I had a father who was an economics professor, so I'm having flashbacks to those lectures I got when I was a kid. But I read Bastiat at a very early age, and it was my Dr. Seuss, essentially. But what we had coming into 2017 was a situation where China was eating our lunch. TPP cemented that status quo in place. And so for Trump to abandon TPP and walk away and say, we have to have a new deal with China, we're going to stand up to China on trade issues, was revolutionary. It really did reset the game. And Trump did something interesting with tariffs. He didn't use them in a permanent sense to alter the trading landscape. What he did was he used it as a tool, along with many other tools, to get to the end. It was a means to the end of a free trade agreement. And he got to phase one with China, which China is already reneging on, but the status quo was unacceptable. $200 million a year in intellectual property theft by the Chinese government, just ignoring international agreement after international agreement with the United States and the rest of the world for intellectual property rights. And so for the Trump administration, it was imperative, not just for relationships with China, but for our standing throughout the world when it came to trade agreements. It was time to stand up for the American worker. It was time to stand up for American businesses. And it was time to stand up and make America great again. Now we have a Biden administration that wants to make China great again. And we have to stand up and say, no, we're not going to step back on taking tools away from the United States, because tariffs can be a tool to the end of a free trade agreement, putting them back in the toolbox and closing the lid. Because all that does is send a message to China and any other nation that we're involved in trade talks with that we're not going to use all the tools available to us. What we need to do is to continue to have that toolbox open, continue to have tariffs as an available tool, one which I don't prefer to use, but one which China needs to understand is out there. Canada and Mexico understood, and that's one of the reasons we have the USMCA. And South Korea, there were several other nations that this administration worked out great trade deals with and made progress toward supporting American businesses and supporting the American worker through freer trade. That's the kind of relationship we need to have with China, but we can only do that through strength. We cannot do it by backing off of the advantage the progress we have made over the last 4 years. So to that end, I would say here's hoping that President Biden is different than Vice President Biden, different than Senator Biden was, but I'm not going to put my money on that. But thank you for having us. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you, Congressman. And finally, but certainly not least among us, from the great Sunshine State, Congresswoman Kat Cammack is going to talk about our neighbors to the south and Mexico in particular.
C. No, it's a real pleasure. This is my first time speaking at CPAC, so I'm thrilled to be here. And the fact that this is in my home state, an hour and a half south of my district, the Gator Nation, if there's any Gator fans in here. I see some chomps going on around here. It's fantastic. So huge shout out to CPAC for putting together one heck of a program in the midst of a pandemic and all the challenges that come with it. So shout out to you guys. And a very happy 12th birthday to my good friend, Ben Cline. I think you're the first leap year baby that I know. So it's exciting. But, you know, representing a district in Florida, we are truly an international state. We import, we export, we have 14 deep water ports here, 23 military installations, and I am honored to serve on both the House Agriculture Committee as well as the Homeland Security Committee in Congress. As the youngest Republican woman in Congress, I feel like I bring a little bit of a different perspective to these issues, and there's a natural nexus when you talk about agriculture and Homeland Security and how that plays into our trade deals. So USMCA was incredible. It reset the balance of power, really, and reset policies that had been needing to be updated for so long. And it did tremendous good for the United States. I think my colleagues have hit on it perfectly, the advantages to USMCA. One thing that we needed to fix that is still lingering, that was broken under NAFTA, was a component dealing with agriculture. Mexico is the biggest threat to American agriculture, and as a nation, we produce food not just for our communities and our states and our country, but we feed the world. And when you look at what Mexico has done to agriculture here in my home state, it is devastating. And it's because there are broken components in previous trade deals that weren't able to be fixed right away. But President Trump had made the commitment to make these fixes, and now it remains to be seen, will Biden uphold his end of the bargain and support American agriculture by making these fixes? What we see coming across the border is dumping. And let's talk about free trade, but fair trade in terms of agriculture. They essentially use slave labor. We pay our workers maybe $12 to $15 an hour. They pay them $12 a day. Let's talk about the environmental side of things that the left is so keen on shoving down our throats, right? They're using chemicals that were banned in America 50 years ago. We have got to get really serious and tough on Mexico, who hides behind organizations like the WTO, which the United States funds predominantly. So when we're talking about this issue of free trade, it is critical. But I will put my American producers up against any farmers in the world to do it better, safer, and cheaper than anybody. But it has to be on a level playing field. So this is why it's so important that we're having this discussion here today, because agriculture is national security. And when you look at Florida, the #1 driver of our state's economy is agriculture. And a nation that cannot feed itself is not secure. And the Biden administration has their hands full, because they have been very disingenuous from the get-go on their campaigns about what they were going to stand for, what they were going to do. And so far, we've seen nothing but, 5 dozen executive orders to this point that have been completely contrary to what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail. So it's incumbent upon all of us in this room to hold the administration's feet to the fire, as well as the ultra-liberal left, because our nation is at stake. But I have to say, we voted on a $1.9 trillion package at 2:30 this morning, and I was telling my colleagues, I had a Democratic staffer come up to me 2:30 this morning and said, "We just handed you guys the majority. We're going to fix these problems, and we're going to be world powers again." And I got to finish out with Go Gators.
You're doing great. want to swing back, though, to Congressman Norman. A lot of us Yankees still think of South Carolina as a textile state. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about greater protection from unfair trade practices and fraud in the textile industry.
Oh yeah, and we're home to Milliken, which was a fantastic manufacturer in Spartanburg, South Carolina. They were leaders in innovation. They were very active politically in stating their case as to why the country, China primarily, was undercutting their product. And they were real active when President Trump put the 232 tariff on, the exemptions that went with it, the fact that they stopped China, they had disallowed China from making the robes and not having and undercutting the prices and eliminating the competition. The other thing that he did, not just for manufacturing, but he had this thing called exemptions. In the car manufacturing business, you had to have the car 75% of the product rules of origin, which the products that went into the car were made in North America. Now, if America couldn't make it, and if it didn't have the product line available, then he would have an exemption for that and allow under a certain time period. That only comes because he had the knowledge base to be able to impose that and give the company time to make the product either in America or Mexico and primarily Mexico and Canada. But unless he had the street sense and the business experience, he wouldn't be able to do that, which he did, and he imposed it. The same thing with the wages, the $16 an hour. People stepped up to the plate to pay that. NAFTA never did that. And that was some of the real causes of the complaints that that all the manufacturers had, farmers had, and the companies that located to South Carolina. We have got to make sure that we, under the Biden administration, we let our voices be heard with the problems we're going to have with trade, because he's a compromised candidate, folks. He's compromised. You can't make a claim against a candidate for getting illegal money. And it's coming from our worst enemy, China. The press had no interest in pursuing it, and it's something that we have got to pursue individually, and we've got to keep the pressure on with them.
Thank you. And I want to turn to Congressman McClintock, but before I do, I just want to say, Congressman, that rarely have I heard the case for free trade so succinctly and clearly laid out as you did just a couple of minutes ago. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
You ought to applaud all of you. That was really something.
It wasn't his best yet.
I want to ask.
Best yet, Kudlow and Laffer get the credit.
I want to
for
ask
that.
a specific question about intellectual property, because I have heard that our friends from China may from time to time borrow our intellectual property.
Well, they steal like the dickens, but that's what communists do. But that should not justify us taking actions that are harmful to ourselves. This business of putting a gun to your head and say, stop stealing our stuff or I'll shoot the hostage is not exactly a rational policy. And let me take on this concept of dumping for just a moment. How does a country dump a product in another market? And by the way, again, remember this. We're completely forgetting about the consumers when we're talking about dumping. We're only talking about protecting the producers without realizing the consumers are getting an enormous benefit, and they get it in one of two ways. A country will either use the government taxes to subsidize its product, actually use their resources to make that product cheaper for us to buy in this country when they export it to us. Well, Milton Friedman once said, isn't that called foreign aid? How does it harm our economy if some other country is stupid enough to use their taxes to help us buy their stuff? The polite thing to do in such a circumstance is to say, thank you. The other question is, well, they can produce it cheaper in their country because of labor rates, resources, whatever. Well, that's the whole point of abundance and scarcity. If another country can produce a product cheaper than we can, we ought to buy all of that we can. That's what is creating abundance. We shouldn't be slapping a tariff on that and creating scarcity for ourselves out of that abundance. And what the market then does is to signal to producers very simple issues. If Mexico can produce lettuce more efficiently than we can, that is, if we can buy more lettuce for the dollar from Mexico than we can from ourselves, that's a good thing for our consumers, and it signals our producers, maybe we ought to find something else to produce where we can produce it cheaper. Cherries, for example. Now, you can't, under that kind of an arrangement, you're probably not going to sell a lot of lettuce in Mexico. They can grow it cheaper for themselves, and we can buy it cheaper from them. But at the same time, we'll be exporting cherries to them that we can produce more efficiently. So the moment we start playing this, well, we have to protect the producer here or the producer there. We're completely forgetting about the consumers and impoverishing ourselves as a result. And again, back to this notion of dependence upon China. China is an existential threat. But one way to reduce that threat, as Bastiat wrote 150 years ago, is trade. Because trade increases the cost of war, and it also increases the value of peace. Because when any two parties are trading, they are both benefiting. If I give you $1 for a cup of coffee, what's going on in that transaction? You're telling me that my dollar is worth more to you than your cup of coffee, and at the same moment, I'm telling you your cup of coffee is worth more to me than my dollar. When we make that exchange, we both go away the richer for it. We both go away with something of greater value than we took into that transaction. Every trade works the same way, including international trade. All that government can do is gum that up and destroy the value of that transaction for one or both parties. And as long as both parties are prospering from trade, you've increased the value of peace dramatically. It's the old thank you game. If you ever stand by a cash register, you'll notice something. The clerk always says thank you to the customer, and the customer always says thank you back to the clerk, because they're both benefiting from that transaction. We've got to stand for free trade. Like I said, if we don't, nobody will.
Congressman Cline, I want to let you weigh in on IP and any other issues that you'd like to bring up as a second thought.
Sure. Virginia is the second largest agricultural state on the East Coast, and so ag is very important, and the USMCA was a major part of Virginia's economic recovery when it comes to agriculture production, and we're very excited about it when it comes to poultry, when it comes to turkeys in particular, but also forest products. The USMCA was a major boost for my part of Virginia, which is the West Virginia border, Shenandoah Valley. But I completely agree, and I think that over the past 4 years, we have seen the Trump administration promote a very pro-free trade agenda. But they have tried to stand up to an imbalance, most notably with China, and try and address some of the more egregious parts of that relationship. The IP theft is one of those parts. And when it impacts China doesn't have a motion picture industry. They don't have any kind of content production really going on in China. It's all here in California, and for the most part. But and so it does have an impact when China ignores the rules and comes in and takes without purchasing, which is not free trade, it's theft, and it takes from the mouths of the producers in California of that content. And it's very much a situation where the U.S. understands that if we are competing with other nations on a level playing field, we will win. We have the hardest working, best educated workers. We have the most diverse nation with the most abundant supply of products in the world. So we should be winning this trade battle around the world. But what you have are nations like China that tilt the scales unfairly through theft, through illegal means, to advantage themselves in the trade relationship. Much in the same way, I'm having this conversation and I'm thinking this is a lot like international trade as I'm preparing for this, when we were talking about H.R. 1 and this election bill that's coming up. We know that the Democrats can't beat us on ideas. When we are competing on the battle of ideas with the liberal left, we win. We talk about freedom, we talk about liberty, we talk about our Constitution rights, First Amendment, Second Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And the left has the power of the state, and that's what they use every time, and they lose every time when you enter into those arguments. So what are they going to do with H.R. 1? They're going to try and tilt the playing field in their favor by limiting those rights, by limiting the free speech rights of campaigns, by limiting the rights of the voters. And so they know that if they can get H.R. 1 passed using your own tax dollars to support candidates with whom you don't even agree, that will help them maintain these majorities that they have been able to get and into perpetuity. We know that that's not the way things should be done, so we're going to fight that tooth and nail. We're going to fight the attempt to tilt the scale on the electoral front, and we are going to continue to fight China and any other country that is trying to tilt the scale on the international trade front. So that's what I hope this administration will do, but I don't think it's going to come near as close to the level of fight that we took to the nations of the world that were competing unfairly as the Trump administration did.
And Congresswoman, you may get the last word this afternoon, because it's hard to imagine that 45 minutes has passed so quickly, but this has been a really compelling panel with some really great voices, and yours gets to be the last. But I want to ask, in addition to everything else that you've heard and want to reply to or comment on, what can Congress do and what should they do?
Well, I wish I would have thought of this earlier, but I was kind of hoping that each of us could say China the way that President Trump addresses it. It would have made for great, great coverage of this panel as China. But you know, I think what everything that you've heard from my colleagues up here has been spot on about free trade, the necessity to support free trade, to look at ways that we can combat the theft. And by the way, you know, of course, I'm the lone Republican when it comes to fighting for ag in the great state of Florida. You talk about theft. Mexico has stolen the intellectual property, all of the research that has gone into the latest crop of blueberries. They steal it. You know who pays a royalty? American producers. Meanwhile, Mexico produces the exact same, no cost. And that happens with strawberries, that happens with ferns, orchids, you name it. And I know, Tom, you and I, we're probably going to have to put on some boxing gloves at some point, and we'll go at it talking about ag and Mexico. But, you know, when you think about what's happening in Mexico, and I keep going back to it because it's so important. Just last week, I was on a farm about 60 miles south of here, standing in 100 acres of disked up squash. Why? Because Mexico was importing their squash at a fraction of what our producers could do it, but guess who's transporting it? The cartels. $11 million worth of methamphetamine was in that shipment. When it comes to the avocado industry, the lime industry, the cartels are subsidizing the farmers and the production in Mexico, and that is why I am so adamant that we have got to be firm. Do I think that Joe Biden is going to stand up and take on Mexico? Hell no. But you know who is? Us. We are going to take the fight on because that's what we are here to do. We're here to stand up for conservatives. And when you talk about what Congress can do to support free trade, what we're going to be doing, we're going to outmaneuver the Democrats. We are taking the House back in 2 years. We are going to make right all the wrongs that have happened. And I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to give it right back to you.
Well, that was a pretty good last word for this panel. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking 4 great members of Congress.
Thank you, guys.
Congressman Norman, Congressman McClintock, Congressman Cline, and Congresswoman Womack. Thank you so much.